Sophie, a 28-year-old professional woman, had grown accustomed to the unpredictable world of online dating. The highs, the lows, the seemingly endless cycle of messages, then brief meetings, followed by disappointing goodbyes. She'd learned to take it all in stride, adapting to the fleeting nature of connections in the digital age. But Adam was different. From the very first message, he stood out from the others. His words were sincere, his profile charming, and the chemistry between them was undeniable. Their first few weeks together were filled with easy conversations, laughter, and shared moments that made Sophie feel like she had finally found someone who truly understood her. He made her feel special in a way that no one had before. Adam was attentive, affectionate, and, at times, almost too perfect. They spent long hours talking, exploring their common interests, and getting to know each other in a way Sophie hadn't experienced in a long time. She found herself smiling whenever his name popped up on her phone, her heart fluttering at the thought of him. But as the relationship progressed, subtle cracks began to appear. His stories didn't always match up. One moment he'd mention growing up in a small town, and the next, he'd say he'd lived in the city his entire life. When Sophie pressed him for more details about his childhood, the answers were vague, almost rehearsed. He seemed uncomfortable talking about his past, and Sophie's questions were often met with a quick change of subject. At first, she shrugged it off. No one's perfect. She had her own secrets, after all. But the inconsistencies began to pile up, and Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a nagging voice in her head telling her not to trust him, but she couldn't pinpoint why. Everything seemed so perfect. One night, after an awkward silence hung between them for what felt like hours, Sophie finally gathered the courage to confront Adam about the mounting doubts she had been ignoring. They were sitting in his apartment, the soft glow of the lamps casting long shadows on the walls. She had been replaying his words in her mind, trying to piece everything together, but the puzzle didn't fit. The questions that had been swirling around her mind couldn't stay contained any longer. Adam, I need to ask you something, Sophie said, her voice steady but tinged with hesitation. Adam glanced up from the glass of wine he was swirling in his hand, a slight frown crossing his face. What's on your mind? She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. I've been thinking about some of the things you've said, and they don't really add up. Like, when you talk about your childhood, or where you've lived, sometimes it feels like you're avoiding the details. Adam's smile faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. You're overthinking things, Sophie, he said, setting the glass down and leaning back in his chair, his tone calm and reassuring. I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this. It's just a bit of forgetfulness. Everyone has a blurry memory from time to time. Sophie frowned, her gaze narrowing slightly. But it's not just the details. It's like you're hiding something. I'm not hiding anything. Adam's voice softened, and he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. You know that. I've been open with you. Sophie pulled her hand back, crossing her arms over her chest. I don't know, Adam. You're so perfect, too perfect sometimes. And when I ask you questions about your past, you seem uncomfortable. He let out a chuckle, a smooth, almost practiced sound. Sophie, I told you. It's not a big deal. You're just reading too much into it. Maybe it's time for you to relax a little. We've been getting along great, right? Her heart clenched as she looked at him, trying to figure out whether she was overreacting. He looked sincere, too sincere. But something about his words felt rehearsed, like he had delivered them 100 times before. The tension in the room was thick, and Sophie could feel it weighing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She wanted to believe him, she really did. She wanted the perfect relationship, the one that made her feel safe and loved. But the doubt was there, lingering at the edges of her mind. She nodded, though the unease still gnawed at her. I guess you're right. Maybe I am overthinking. After that night, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The nagging doubts lingered, growing with each passing day. His answers became more evasive, his stories more inconsistent. Sophie found herself wondering if she had missed something important, something that could explain the oddities she had noticed. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the more she tried to ignore it, the more it seemed like she was in denial. She needed to know the truth, even if it meant uncovering something she wasn't ready to face. It was a quiet evening a few days later when Sophie decided to take matters into her own hands. She had to know more. She had already noticed the gaps in Adam's story, but now she needed to dig deeper. She logged into his social media profile, something she had never done before, and was immediately struck by how strangely blank it was. There were no photos, no personal details, not even a single post beyond a few generic status updates. It was as though his entire life had been wiped clean. Sophie's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart racing as she navigated through his sparse profile. It was clear now that Adam had been hiding something, and she needed to know what. She couldn't stop now. Sophie decided to go a step further. She dug into his past, searched for any clues that could explain the growing sense of dread she was feeling. Each search only deepened her suspicion. His online presence was non-existent, his background impossible to trace. The absence of any concrete details about Adam's life only fueled her anxiety. She was uncovering nothing, and that, in itself, was something. She had to confront him again, but this time, the questions would be sharper, more direct. The next night, after another seemingly perfect evening together, Sophie woke in the middle of the night, restless. She couldn't stop thinking about the oddities she had found. Her heart was pounding, and she needed a distraction. She got out of bed, quietly slipping on her slippers, and walked down the hallway of Adam's apartment. Her gaze drifted to the living room, where the dim glow of a single lamp illuminated the space. That's when she noticed it, a door, slightly ajar, in the far corner of the room. Sophie froze. She hadn't seen this door before. Curiosity bubbled up in her chest, mingled with a sense of unease. What was behind it? She didn't want to open it, but the need to know was overpowering. Sophie slowly pushed the door open, her breath catching in her throat. The room beyond was dark, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The walls were lined with photographs of women, all of them with a red X marked across their faces. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as her own photo caught her eye, clearly placed among the others. There, in the center, was her face, marked with a red X. Sophie stumbled backward, her mind reeling. This wasn't just a collection of photographs. There were detailed notes beneath each one, names, addresses, phone numbers. The names of women who had once been like her, just a face on a dating app. A sickening realization washed over her as she pieced it together. Adam wasn't the man he had appeared to be. He wasn't the charming, perfect guy she had fallen for. He was a predator. And Sophie was his next target. Her stomach twisted as she took another step into the room, her eyes scanning the objects that littered the table in front of her, jewelry, watches, personal items that belonged to the women in the photographs. Adam had been collecting mementos from his victims. Sophie's mind raced, each horrifying thought tumbling over the next. Adam had been using the dating app to track and target women, keeping twisted trophies from his murders. Sophie's breath hitched, her hands shaking as she realized just how deep she was in. This was no longer just a bad feeling. It was a nightmare come to life. Sophie's hands shook as she carefully snapped pictures of the evidence around her. The weight of what she had discovered settled like a stone in her stomach, and she could hardly process it. Adam, the man she had trusted, the man she had let into her life, was a predator. The room she had stumbled upon was like a twisted shrine, a record of his crimes, his victims' faces, their lives reduced to photographs with a red X scrawled over them. And there, in the center of it all, was her own photo. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized just how close she was to becoming one of the marked. Sophie's mind raced as she snapped more pictures of the photographs and personal belongings spread across the table. She knew she needed to leave. She needed to expose him before he could hurt anyone else, before he could hurt her. Every second spent in this room felt like an eternity, and every click of the camera felt like a countdown. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she quickly grabbed a few of the items from the table, shoving them into her purse. The personal mementos, the jewelry, anything she could use to prove his twisted game. But just as she reached for the final piece of evidence, a soft creak of a floorboard behind her froze her in place. Sophie's heart leapt into her throat. Adam. He was awake. Her body went rigid. She could hear his voice, low and muffled, murmuring something. Panic shot through her, and her breath quickened. She had no time to think, no time to plan. She had to get out now. Her hands moved frantically, slipping the last few items into her purse, but the sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze again. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She turned toward the door, but the thought of running toward the living room, to the main exit, paralyzed her. Adam was coming. He was already awake and moving, and if he saw her, if he found her in his secret room, he would stop at nothing to silence her. She hurried toward the door, pushing it open as quietly as possible, praying she wouldn't make a sound. Her breath was shallow, her movements quick and deliberate, but every second felt like an eternity. She had to leave, had to get out of the apartment before Adam could stop her. But as she stepped into the dark hallway, Sophie's heart sank. The door to the living room was still open, and she could hear Adam's voice growing louder, clearer. She could feel him getting closer, each step a reminder that time was running out. The tension was unbearable. She didn't have a plan, not really, just the overwhelming need to escape. Sophie's fingers were trembling as she reached for the nearest exit, the front door. But then, her eyes darted across the room. Something caught her attention, a symbol painted on the wall. It was subtle at first, almost hidden in the shadows, but once she saw it, she couldn't look away. It wasn't just a random mark. It was part of a pattern, strange, cryptic symbols that covered the walls, each one more elaborate than the last. The symbols weren't just decoration. Sophie's stomach twisted with a sickening realization. These were markings, deliberate and methodical, and they weren't just random designs. She could feel the dread crawling up her spine as she examined them more closely. They were signs, of what, Sophie wasn't sure, but they were definitely part of Adam's world. Part of the twisted reality he'd built around himself. Her hands were no longer trembling in uncertainty, now, they were shaking with fear. Sophie's mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing. Was Adam involved in something bigger than she realized? These symbols didn't just represent dates or names. They seemed ritualistic. Sophie was no longer just looking at a room filled with photographs and trophies. She was looking at the evidence of something far darker than she had initially thought. The footsteps came closer, snapping her back to reality. She had no time to dwell on the symbols. She had to move. Sophie bolted toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, she froze. The sound of a door opening sent a jolt through her. Adam. He was there. In a flash, Sophie pulled the door open and stepped into the living room. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her legs felt like they were moving in slow motion. The world outside the door was an unknown, an escape. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. But just as she was about to run, she heard Adam's voice behind her, calm, almost amused. "Where do you think you're going, Sophie?" The blood drained from her face. Her body froze in place, the words hanging in the air between them like a heavy weight. She knew that voice. It was the voice of a man who had been playing her all along. It was the voice of the man who had stalked and manipulated her from the very beginning. Sophie turned slowly, her chest tight with fear. Adam stood there in the doorway, his eyes cold and calculating. He was wearing that same smile, the one he had always worn when he knew he had the upper hand. But this time, there was no charm in it. There was no warmth. He was a predator, and she was the prey. Adam, Sophie's voice came out weak, almost a whisper, but she couldn't stop herself from speaking. I found your secret room. I know what you've been doing. His eyes flickered for a moment, just a brief flash of surprise, before the mask of indifference slid back into place. What room? He asked, his voice too calm, too rehearsed. I think you're mistaken. Sophie's blood ran cold. He was denying it. Even now, after she had seen everything, Adam was lying. He was trying to manipulate her again. But Sophie wasn't going to let him. Not this time. I'm not stupid, she snapped, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. I saw the photos, the personal items. I know what you've been doing to those women. Adam's smile faded, his expression darkening. You shouldn't have gone looking, Sophie. His voice dropped, becoming low and menacing. Now, you know too much. Before Sophie could react, Adam lunged at her. She didn't even have time to scream before he grabbed her arm, yanking her back into the apartment with brutal force. She fought, trying to break free, but his grip was unyielding. Sophie struggled, using every ounce of strength she had, but Adam was too strong. She kicked at him, her feet connecting with his chest, but he didn't budge. In the chaos, Sophie's hands found a lamp on the nearby table. Without thinking, she swung it at him, the glass shattering on impact. The alcohol from the lamp splashed onto the floor, igniting in a burst of flames. The fire spread quickly, licking at the curtains, racing up the walls. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The apartment was going up in flames. Adam's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly recovered, his eyes flashing with fury. You're going to pay for that, he snarled. Sophie turned, scrambling toward the door, but she could already hear the flames roaring behind her. The fire was growing, faster than she had anticipated, and the room was becoming a furnace. She ran, adrenaline pushing her forward, but Adam was right behind her. In the midst of the chaos, Sophie reached for the door, desperate to escape the apartment that was rapidly turning into a trap. She couldn't get out. The smoke was too thick, and the fire too fast. As the flames closed in, Sophie heard Adam's voice one last time. You can't run, Sophie. You never could. And then, in the smoke and fire, she realized the truth. He wasn't just a killer. He had been manipulating the police, the entire system. Adam had avoided capture because of his connections. Sophie's heart sank as she understood the full extent of his reach. The danger wasn't just in the apartment. It was everywhere. She stumbled toward the window, but as she reached it, the fire consumed the apartment. She was trapped, the flames closing in. Sophie's body screamed in agony, but there was nowhere to run. Sophie gasped for air, each breath feeling like inhaling a furnace. Her lungs burned with every cough as the thick, acrid smoke surrounded her like a suffocating blanket. The heat was unbearable, pressing down on her skin with an intensity that made her muscles seize. The flames roared behind her, a monstrous beast consuming everything in its path. The crackling of the fire was a constant reminder that she couldn't stop, she couldn't afford to. Each step felt like wading through hot tar, her feet heavy and unsteady, but Sophie pushed forward. Her heart pounded in her chest like the drumbeat of impending doom, echoing through her body as the fire closed in. She couldn't let it take her. Not when she was so close to escaping. The smoke grew thicker with each passing second, clouding her vision, disorienting her. Sophie stumbled, a sudden wave of dizziness making the world tilt before her eyes. She fought against the wave of panic rising in her chest, clenching her teeth and forcing herself to keep moving. Her clothes clung to her skin, soaked with sweat and soot, her breath shallow and ragged. She couldn't stop. The thought of being consumed by the flames, of being trapped in Adam's apartment, made her fight through the suffocating haze. She couldn't let Adam, or the fire, trap her here. Finally, Sophie stumbled out of the room, her body shaking from both the heat and the fear that gnawed at her insides. She emerged into the hallway, but it wasn't the escape she had hoped for. The apartment was a maze of smoke and flame. The air was thick and oppressive, every inhalation burning her lungs like fire itself. The heat was even more intense out here, the walls already beginning to blacken as the flames crept toward her. Sophie's mind raced, panic creeping in as she realized just how dire the situation had become. Adam was still somewhere in the building. She didn't know where, but the fear that he was closing in on her made her blood run cold. She staggered down the corridor, her legs like jelly beneath her, struggling to find her bearings. The smoke clouded her thoughts, making everything feel far away and out of reach. Her breath came in shallow bursts, the world around her a blur of burning orange and grey. Her chest tightened with every step, each footfall seeming to echo in the empty space. Sophie couldn't remember the layout of the apartment. The familiar walls seemed alien now, twisted by the smoke and the flames. She had to find an exit, but the more she searched, the more everything seemed to blur into chaos. A glimmer of hope flickered when Sophie spotted the fire escape door at the far end of the hallway. She rushed toward it, the sound of her frantic footsteps ringing in her ears, but as her hand reached for the handle, her heart dropped. The door was locked. Sophie's pulse quickened, panic rising like a tidal wave. She grabbed the handle and twisted, but the door wouldn't budge. She yanked at it, pounding her fists against the door frame, the feeling of helplessness growing with every second. The fire was closing in fast, the heat increasing as the walls around her began to crumble. Adam was out there. He was somewhere in the building, and the thought of him hunting her down, of him being so close, sent a chill running through her veins. She couldn't stay here. The door was her only chance to escape, but it was locked. Sophie's frantic efforts grew more desperate. Her hands were slick with sweat as she pounded on the door, her heart racing. Every second was critical. Every second she wasted here, Adam was getting closer. The fire crackled behind her, the heat unbearable, making her feel like the walls were closing in. She couldn't give up. Not now. A small sound caught Sophie's attention, a faint thud on the floor, almost drowned by the roaring flames. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she thought she had imagined it. But then it came again, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coming from somewhere behind her. Sophie's blood ran cold as she realized Adam was getting closer. He was out there, moving in the smoke, hunting her. Her breath hitched as she turned around, but the smoke was too thick to see anything clearly. The sound of Adam's footsteps grew louder, and her pulse spiked. Panic surged through her, cold, raw wave of fear that made her stomach twist. She had to move. She couldn't wait for him to find her. Sophie glanced around frantically, her mind racing. The fire was closing in, and Adam was closing in too. Sophie's legs felt heavy, like she was moving through water, each step slower than the last. Her breath came faster, her lungs desperate for air, but she couldn't stop. The fear of being caught, of Adam catching her, drove her forward. Just as Sophie thought she might lose hope entirely, her eyes caught a glimmer of light at the far end of the hall. A window, shattered and wide open, with the cold night air filtering in. It was her only chance. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized this was the escape she needed. She pushed herself forward, her legs burning with the effort, ignoring the agony in her muscles, ignoring the fire that raged behind her. The cold air from outside was the first real relief she had felt since the fire started, the contrast like a lifeline. She could barely think as she reached the window, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The relief that washed over her was brief, replaced by a surge of desperation. This was her only chance. She could feel the fire closing in, the heat reaching her back, licking at her heels. Sophie reached up, hands trembling as she grabbed the ledge of the window, preparing to pull herself up. The glass was jagged and sharp, but it was her only way out. She had to make this work. Sophie's fingers scraped against the jagged edges of the broken window, the glass cutting into her palms, but she didn't stop. She pulled herself upward, her body shaking with exhaustion. Every muscle in her arms burned, her legs like lead, but she couldn't stop now. She had to climb, had to get out of the building. The fire was relentless behind her, its heat pressing closer, threatening to pull her back into the inferno. Sophie could feel the burn of the smoke in her throat, but she ignored it, focusing only on the window. The ledge was too high, and the slippery glass beneath her hands made it difficult to hold on. Her balance wavered, her legs trembling from the strain, but she kept going. She was so close, just inches away from freedom, but the terror of falling, of failing, gripped her. Her heart raced in her chest, a drumbeat of fear urging her to move faster. Every second felt like an eternity. She didn't have time to waste. Just as Sophie managed to steady herself on the window ledge, she heard Adam's voice, low, filled with a cruel amusement. "You think you can outrun me, Sophie? You're mine now. It's too late." The words sliced through her like a blade. Sophie froze, her blood running cold. Adam's voice was close, too close. She could hear him, feel his presence behind her, looming in the smoke. Sophie turned slowly, her eyes locking onto him. He stood at the end of the hallway, his silhouette framed by the flames, his twisted smile barely visible through the smoke. He wasn't far away, he was right there. Her mind spun as she realized the full weight of his words. She was trapped. There was no way out. Adam was too fast. He was too strong. Sophie's stomach churned as she stared at him, the weight of terror settling over her. But Sophie couldn't let it consume her. She wouldn't let him win. Sophie's hands trembled, but her mind was clear. This was it, she had to escape. She shoved the window open wider, ignoring the sting of broken glass cutting into her palms. The fresh air outside felt like a lifeline, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat from inside. Sophie steadied herself, every muscle in her body screaming for rest, but she knew she couldn't stop now. She had no choice but to keep moving. Adam was right there, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She couldn't let him have that satisfaction. She glanced down at the ground far below. The thought of the drop, of the fall, made her stomach lurch. But she had no other choice. She shoved the fear aside, focusing on the only thing that mattered, survival. She had to get out. She had to be free. Before Sophie could make the leap, Adam lunged at her. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with terrifying speed. Sophie gasped in shock, her body jerked off balance, the fire closing in on her as he pulled her back into the inferno. Sophie's chest constricted as her heart hammered in her throat. She kicked and struggled, but Adam's grip was unyielding, like iron around her wrist. His twisted grin sent a wave of nausea through her as he dragged her back toward the fire. Sophie could feel the smoke choking her, the heat blistering her skin, but she couldn't let him win. She twisted her body, her legs kicking desperately as she tried to break free. Every part of her screamed to escape, but Adam's strength was overwhelming. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. She couldn't go back inside. She had to fight. Sophie's body burned with exhaustion, but desperation surged through her. She twisted with all her might, using her remaining strength to break free from Adam's grasp. She kicked him hard in the knee, the impact making him stumble backward. The brief moment of disorientation gave Sophie the chance she needed. She grabbed a broken piece of furniture from nearby, gripping it tightly in her hands. Without hesitation, she swung it at Adam's face with all her strength. The blow landed with a sickening crack, knocking him off balance. Sophie didn't hesitate. She ran for the window again, her breath ragged, her body trembling from the effort. The fire raged behind her, but she didn't look back. She knew this was her only chance. She had to take it. As Sophie reached the window, Adam recovered quickly, his rage boiling over. He lunged at her again, his hands reaching for her, but Sophie was ready. She dodged his grasp, using the momentum of his attack against him. With a powerful shove, she sent Adam tumbling into the flames. His body hit the fire with a sickening scream as the flames engulfed him, consuming him in seconds. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't hesitate. She climbed through the broken window, ignoring the sharp pain from the glass as she leapt into the night. Sophie hit the ground hard, her body slamming into the pavement with a jolt. Pain shot through her legs, but she didn't stop. She pushed herself to her feet and ran, her legs burning with the effort, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't have time to think, didn't have time to rest. She had to get away. She had to put as much distance between herself and the nightmare she had just escaped. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the empty streets, the only sound filling the night. But even as she ran, the fear didn't leave her. Sophie knew the nightmare wasn't over. Not yet. Sophie's legs were shaking as she stumbled toward her apartment. The night air felt unusually cold against her skin, the rush of adrenaline leaving her limbs weak and her mind still reeling from the chaos she had just escaped. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the burn in her chest never fully fading as she ran, adrenaline and fear still coursing through her veins. She had made it out of the fire. She had outrun Adam, but her victory felt hollow. The realization that he had connections in places she never imagined, that he had been manipulating so many around her, gnawed at her from the inside. She had nowhere to hide now. When Sophie turned the corner onto her street, she saw the flashing red and blue lights first. Her stomach dropped like a stone. The familiar sight of her apartment building was tainted by the presence of police cars and uniformed officers. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. A cold wave of fear washed over her as she took in the scene. Her instinct told her to turn around, to run, but her legs refused to obey. She couldn't escape again. She had to face this head-on. As she slowly approached, her eyes locked on a figure standing just outside the entrance to her building. Detective Harris, the same officer who had been kind to her, who had always seemed to understand her distress, stood there. But something was different this time. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she saw his expression. It wasn't the concerned, sympathetic face she was used to. Instead, his face was unreadable, distant. The warmth she had once felt from him was gone, replaced by something cold, almost predatory. "Miss Foster," Harris said, his voice too calm for Sophie's liking, too flat. "We've been expecting you." Sophie's pulse quickened, and confusion flooded her mind. "Expecting me?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had so many questions, so many things she needed to ask. But the way Harris looked at her, no longer as a victim, but as someone who had crossed a line, made her feel like she was trapped in a nightmare. The concern she once trusted in his eyes was nowhere to be found. In its place was a chilling detachment. Before she could speak, Sophie noticed two more officers standing nearby. They didn't look familiar, and their cold, emotionless expressions sent a shiver down her spine. They stood stiffly, arms crossed, their eyes fixed on her with a strange intensity. Sophie's stomach churned as she recognized the feeling settling over her. They are with him. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Adam had manipulated more than just her, He had tangled his web so deeply that even the police were part of it. She was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Her mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Adam's reach wasn't just confined to her apartment or the fire he set, it extended everywhere. He had been watching her, controlling her every move. He had connections in places Sophie hadn't even considered. The officers in front of her weren't here to help her. They were part of the game, part of Adam's twisted network. Sophie's breath hitched, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. How far does this go? She tried to steady herself, but the weight of the truth threatened to crush her. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She had become a pawn in a game far bigger than herself. Adam's influence stretched out from the shadows, and now it was closing in on her. Detective Harris, Sophie finally managed to say, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. What is this? What's happening? Harris didn't respond immediately. He simply studied her, his gaze still cold. The familiar warmth she had once trusted was now replaced by something Sophie couldn't place. He wasn't the man she thought she knew. He wasn't there to protect her anymore. I think you know what's going on, Miss Foster, Harris said finally, his tone hard. You've been a part of something much bigger than you realized. And now, it's time to face the consequences. Sophie felt a surge of panic rise in her chest, her pulse quickening again. What are you talking about? She began, but her words faltered as Harris stepped closer to her, his posture rigid, almost threatening. She felt the weight of the situation crashing down on her, but something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let Adam, or anyone connected to him, control her any longer. Sophie had fought too hard to survive, she wasn't going to let this be the end of her story. Just as she opened her mouth to speak again, something caught her attention. The glint of something shiny in the corner of her eye. The flash of a camera from a few feet away. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she turned to face the officers standing further back, holding a camera, snapping photos of her. This wasn't just an arrest, this was a spectacle. They were capturing her in her moment of vulnerability. The horror of her realization hit her like a slap across the face. They've been watching me the entire time. Adam had orchestrated this. He had manipulated the police, and now Sophie was no longer just a victim of his lies, she was a target. She was being framed, and she had no idea how far his control had reached. Sophie's body trembled with a sudden surge of determination. She couldn't let this go on any longer. She couldn't let them control her. She had to fight back. She clenched her fists and forced herself to stand tall, despite the terror that was threatening to overwhelm her. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. I'm not part of this, Sophie said, her voice steady, though her heart was still hammering in her chest. I'm not the one who's been manipulating people. It's Adam. He's the one behind all of this. He's the one who's been pulling the strings, not me. Harris didn't flinch at her words, but Sophie saw something in his eyes, something that made her feel like she was speaking to a stranger. He wasn't listening. It wasn't about justice anymore. It wasn't about the truth. It was about control. And Adam had it. Sophie's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, trying to figure out how she could expose the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. She couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't let Adam's influence destroy her completely. As Sophie stood there, the weight of her victory still heavy on her shoulders, an idea sparked in her mind, one last thing she could do to ensure the truth was known, to make sure Adam's legacy of manipulation and corruption was exposed for everyone to see. Sophie pulled her phone from her pocket, her hands still shaking, and within seconds, she was live. The screen lit up with the familiar red "Live" banner, and Sophie knew that there was no turning back now. She had the world's attention, and she wasn't about to waste it. Sophie's voice rang out, steady but intense, as she faced the camera. "I've been silent for too long," she said, her words punctuated with anger. "But not anymore. The truth is out there, and I'm not letting anyone stop me from telling it." Her gaze shifted to the officers around her, their faces tense with uncertainty. She continued, not waiting for any reaction, her eyes locked on the camera. "Detective Harris is not who he appears to be. These officers, they are part of a larger network. A network controlled by a man named Adam, who has been manipulating the system, using the police, and covering his tracks while innocent people suffered. And I have the proof." With a swift motion, Sophie held up the photographs she had taken, showing them to the camera, letting the world see the twisted evidence she had uncovered in Adam's secret room. The officers around her tried to move closer, their hands reaching for her phone, but Sophie held it out of their reach, her grip tightening. "No," she snapped, her voice rising with determination. "You don't get to take this from me. You don't get to silence me anymore." She turned the camera toward the officers, exposing their cold, detached expressions to the live feed. "This is who they really are. And they're just as guilty as Adam." The officers hesitated. They were unsure of what to do next, clearly aware that Sophie was now out of their control. One officer stepped forward, attempting to snatch the phone from her hand, but Sophie swiftly backed away, her focus unwavering. "This is it," she said, her voice unwavering. "Everything you've been hiding is coming to light. You can't stop me. I'm not afraid of you anymore." Before the officer could make another move, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she looked up, relief flooding her chest. New officers, unfamiliar and determined, arrived at the scene, stepping out of their squad cars with urgency in their eyes. They quickly assessed the situation, recognizing the corruption they were witnessing, and without a second thought, they moved in. The officers who had been working with Adam were surrounded, their faces pale with the sudden realization that they were no longer protected. In the blink of an eye, the new officers took control. "You're under arrest," one of them said, his voice firm, as they moved to handcuff Harris and the other officers involved. Sophie watched, her breath steadying as the corrupt officers were led away, their actions finally exposed for the world to see. The live feed on her phone continued, showing the arrest and the dramatic shift in the power dynamic. The world was watching as justice unfolded before them. As the officers were taken into custody, Sophie stood tall, her heart still racing, but the weight of everything she had endured now lifting from her shoulders. She had won. She had exposed the lies, the manipulation, and the corruption. She had taken back her power, and the truth would no longer be hidden.